welcome. I didn't know that Jewish people were born here in Florida many years ago. We won't go how far back, because from practically everybody I know comes from somewhere else. And in fact, we were speaking with Lynn for a few minutes, and she was telling us that she thinks that 0.05% of Jewish people who live here in Florida come from this state. So we all hail from somewhere else, but fortunately we're all here together to enjoy our services. And today we're going to enjoy Eliot has spent nearly half a century as a reporter with the Palm Beach Post, and in addition to covering local news, he has written extensively about Florida and Florida history. He's a graduate of Florida University. He lives in Boca Raton, and he's a member of the Florida, South Florida, and Palm Beach Historical Societies. He speaks wherever he gets the opportunity to talk about his native land. And he's written more than a dozen books, all focusing on our state. If you look to the back right, my right, you will see there is a table there with several of his books. They're all soft cover, they're inexpensive. And if you want to read about Florida or learn more about it after you've spoken or listened to him, please feel free to go over and have a look at the books. The one that I had an interest in was called Black Cloud, because although I obviously wasn't here at the time, apparently it tells about the history of a massive hurricane that took place over Lake Okeechobee in 1928. It was massive, and there were many, many people killed. And the book is called Black Cloud. He's also written 2 books about weird Florida, and hopefully today he'll tell us something about why Florida is weird, even if we don't think we already know. In addition, our guest runs a blog on bad writing. So for those of you who are interested in creative writing and how to fix it, and it's titled Something Went Horribly Wrong. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to our guest speaker today, Eliot Kleinberg. Would you please welcome him?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for braving the snow and ice to get here. Now, be honest, how many of you in the last week and a half called your friends and family up north to rub it in? My name is Eliot Kleinberg, and I am a native, so now you can say you've seen one. If any of you are in the Audubon Society, there's a box you can check. I did work at the Palm Beach Post. I retired in December of 2020, 33 and a half years at the Post, close to 50 years as a professional journalist. And I did write, let me talk for just a second about newspapers. We have 1.5 million people in Palm Beach County, and the Palm Beach Post has a circulation of 48,000. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that scares the heck out of me. To have that many people who have no idea what's going on in community. You can watch the national news all you want. You can read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, but none of them are going to tell you what the Palm Beach County's commission is going to do. None of you are going to tell you what's going on with Brightline, or why you're paying 7-cent sales tax now and what it's going for, and which pioneer just died. And so if you're not getting the local paper, you're really not getting you don't know anything about your local community, which is really scary, because I don't have to tell you that newspapers are in big trouble right now, financially. And I don't know if I want to live in a democracy full of people that are ignorant as to what's going on in their local community, because when the elected officials, and I'm not saying they will, but when an elected official looks out over the room and no one's there, and nobody knows about the vote they're about to take, they're going to do whatever the heck they want. Now, you'd like to think they're going to do what's right, but sometimes they just do whatever the heck they want. Now, there's about 41 municipalities in Palm Beach County. And then there's about half the county that's not in any municipality, which if you drive about, I don't know, about a mile west of here, you're in what's called unincorporated Palm Beach County. That's not in any city. So if you live in that area where I do, I live just outside of Boca, my government agency is the Palm Beach County Commission. Well, they're sitting up there in West making decisions that are going to affect me. I have no way of knowing unless I read it in the newspaper. So anybody here from Michigan? No? Okay. You've heard of Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's about an hour from Detroit. That's where the University of Michigan is. They don't have a local newspaper anymore. The Detroit paper doesn't cover them. They don't have anybody to cover them. The TV doesn't cover them unless it's football weekend. Well, if the Ann Arbor City Commission votes on Monday that they're going to tear up the road in front of the football stadium the day before the Ohio State game, and then everybody the stadium holds 108,000 people. So then somebody calls the mayor the following Monday and says, "What were you thinking? Tore up the road. It was chaos." He said, "Well, we had a meeting to discuss it. It was in the paper." No paper. So an uninformed citizenry is the prey of unscrupulous leaders, if I may be so direct. So whatever you can do, please, if you don't want to buy our paper, buy the Sun Sentinel. But you really need to be reading your local paper, because if you don't want to read them, that's fine. Once they're gone, you won't have the option. So that's my rant about newspapers. Even though I'm retired, I still am a very strong advocate. I told you how long I worked at the paper. My dad worked at the afternoon paper in Miami for 40 years. Between us, we were in the newspaper business down here for 72 years. I went down to his anniversary this morning, my folks' anniversary. My dad's 89. He's still a better writer than me. The bum. One of the things I did at the newspaper was to start writing a local history column, which I did in between all the car wrecks and city council meetings and everything else. And newspapers, as a rule, they want their reporters focusing on putting today's news in tomorrow's paper. So you ask yourself, how was I able to talk him into letting me write this column? Well, I told him that the average reader of the Palm Beach Post has been here for 10 minutes. So anything you tell them is news. So I wrote the column. It lasted for about 20 years until I retired. And then I started writing a Florida history column that ran in 22 Gannett newspapers around the state that had a newsletter of about 32,000 people. So there's obviously people out there who want to know about Florida because that is where they live now. Let me ask you a question. Any other Florida natives in this room? Wow. Okay, I don't have to tell you that I've done talks where I'll be in a room with 300 people and I'm the only native. How many people have lived in Florida more than 40 years? Like, okay, 30 years? 20? 10? 5? Less than 5? Okay. Now, how many of you moved here from within a 50-mile radius of Madison Square Garden? Now, here's the most important question. How many of you are Floridians? Well, it seems like a trick question, but it's not. If you live here, you're a Floridian, whether you like it or not. I was talking to a lady. She said, "Oh, I'm not a Floridian. I'm a New Yorker retired to Florida." I said, "How long have you been here?" She said, 27 years. I took my kids to Seattle a few years ago, wonderful town. And we were walking around. I'm talking to the people, and something struck me because everywhere you go, and there's a lot of people that moved to Seattle from other parts of the country. And you talk to people, the front desk guy at the hotel, the guy in front of you in line at the diner, a policeman on the corner, and you ask them, they say, "Well, I moved here from Los Angeles. I'm originally from Cleveland. I grew up in San Diego, but I'm a Seattleite now." But that's not what you get in Florida. You don't get, "I'm a Floridian, but I grew up in Brooklyn." What do you get? You get, "I'm a New Yorker living in Florida." And that doesn't work because Florida has a lot of problems, like any state. And it would be hard enough if everybody in Florida was consider themselves Floridians and was working hard to try to fix those problems. But what we have is, okay, the latest numbers I heard is that Florida is 30% native. 30%. That includes the babies. I believe Palm Beach County is 15%. So the analogy I use is a circle. And it would be great if everybody was in the circle. I'll settle for having people having 1 foot in the circle. But what you cannot have is those 30% in the circle and the other 70% outside the circle saying, you Floridians, let us know how it, fix all the problems, let us know how it turns out we're going to be on the golf course. We can't do that. We need people to care about Florida. Now, I'm a big South Florida sports fan right now. Dolphins and Marlins, not a good time. The basketball and the hockey are doing okay. And I listen to the radio talk shows, which I know I shouldn't, I'm a masochist. And the people call in and they say, you South Florida sports fans don't support your team. Why, when the Mets were in town, and I'm not just picking on New Yorkers, when the Mets were in town, we Mets fans filled half the stadium. The guy says, sir, how long have you lived in Florida? He says, 18 years. So the talk show guy says, well, sir, in your mind, who constitutes a South Florida sports fan? Are you talking about the people that grew up here? That's 9 people. So Mr. Met, or Mr. Cubby, or Mr. Philly, when you say no one in South Florida is supporting the Marlins, guess who you're talking about? You're talking about yourself, because you're at home watching the Mets, which is fine. You can root for whoever you want, but then don't complain that no one's supporting the team, okay? So a few years ago, my wife, she worked at one of the big banks, and she had a client whose daughter and son-in-law lived in San Francisco. And by coincidence, they were coming into town to visit, and by coincidence, the San Francisco Giants were playing the Marlins. So she says, would you come with me to entertain my clients, and we'll go to get a great Cuban dinner in downtown Miami, and then we'll go front row seats at the Marlins game. It's a tough assignment, right? So I'm in the ballpark with her, and I'm looking around, and all these people are cheering for the Giants. I couldn't figure it out. It's not like all these people came here from California, right? And then the green light came on. These people were not rooting for the San Francisco Giants. For whom were they rooting? The New York baseball Giants. So these were people who left New York for Florida 40 years ago, rooting for a team that left New York for California 60 years ago, but they would drink battery acid before they root for the home team, and then they want to know why nobody supports the Marlins. Now, this isn't just about sports, okay? But sports is a good metaphor. And here's the part that I think is a real problem. These transplants, again, they can root for whoever they want, but they take their kids and grandkids who were born here and they put them in a Yankees cap. Why is that a problem? Why is that more than just about baseball? Well, at some point, that kid's going to be an adult, and he's going to be running Florida, and he's got to care about Florida. You got him in a Yankees cap. And I'll tell you one thing else, and this is going to get me in trouble. Remember the joy you had growing up rooting for the home team, reading it in the paper, watching the local news, going out to the ballpark? You are denying your children and grandchildren the joy of their home team because you are pressuring them to root for a team that's 1,000 miles away, okay? And I know I'm stepping on ice here, but just think about it. And so, like I said, this is not just about sports because we need you to care about Florida. We need you to raise your children and grandchildren to care about Florida. Now, a very wise man named Marx, I can never remember if it was Carl or Groucho, once said, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. You've heard that. So I could rant and rave about how nobody in Florida considers themselves Floridians, and I could try to berate you into caring about Florida, but that's not going to work, is it? So, but what I can do is I can educate you about Florida in hopes that it will make you feel more like this is your home, which is why I did the history columns and why I'm continuing to talk about Florida and its history, still writing books, because I hope that the more people I get to, the more they'll care about Florida. Now, part of the problem is pretty much everything you've heard about Florida history is wrong. I know it's a hard pill to swallow. Here's a quiz. Here's a 10-question quiz. And I'm just going to, don't shout out the answers, just think about it. And then I'll get to you at the end. 10 questions about Florida. These are pretty important questions about Florida. Number one, Juan Ponce de Leon was looking for the fountain of youth. Number two, the state got its name because Florida is Spanish for flowers, and they saw flowers on the beach. Number three, during the American Revolution, Florida was a Spanish possession and was not involved. Number four, Seminoles are indigenous to Florida. Number five, Florida has been part of America longer than it was part of Spain. Number six, Florida was neutral in the Civil War. Number seven, neutral in the Civil War. Number seven, Florida never has been bigger in area than it is now. Number eight, Florida never was a Jim Crow state. Number nine, even in the beginning of the 1900s, Miami was the biggest city in Florida. And number 10, modern Florida sprang in 1964 from the forehead of Walt Disney. Okay, think about those questions, right? You're thinking about them. They're kind of boiling on in your head, kind of processing. How many of you think that all those statements are true? Nobody. Half the statements, half of them are true? Yeah. Okay. Every one of those statements is wrong. Every one of them. Juan Ponce de Leon was looking for the fountain. No, not looking at the fountain of youth. By the way, his first name was not Ponce. It was not Ponce. His first name was Juan. His last name was Ponce. He was from the kingdom of Leon. So right away you learn something. Was he looking for the fountain of youth? No, he was 28 years old. He was looking for a land that if the king told him whatever he found, he could be the governor of and get a cut of everything. The fountain of youth legend didn't show up until 50 years after he was dead. Number two, he called it La Florida because of the flowers on the beach. Anybody ever see flowers on the beach? No. Whenever I do this, people are like, yeah, you're right, there are no flowers on the beach. Well, then why did he call it La Florida? Well, the reason he called it La Florida is because it was the tradition of the Spanish explorers when they came across a new place to name it for whatever feast was going on back in Spain. So when Juan Ponce de Leon found this new place, we don't know where, he didn't leave his business card, might have been Jupiter, Cape Canaveral, St. Augustine, we don't know where on the coast he landed. When he found this place, what was going on back in Spain in March of 1513? The Easter festival, the festival of flowers, Pascua de la Florida. You've already gotten your money's worth, haven't you? Number three, during the American Revolution, Florida was a Spanish possession and was not involved. Everyone agree with that one? No. How many of you, I promise I won't tell anybody, how many of you thought that it was Spanish during the American Revolution? You can tell me, I won't tell anybody. All right. Actually, Florida was British. Okay, you're like, what? Here's what happened. Spain, we know, took possession of Florida in Juan Ponce de Leon landed in 1513. They settled St. Augustine in 1565. 1763, Spain and England and France are having their War of the Week. And the British seized Havana and took control of the island of Cuba. And they said to the Spanish, we'll give you back Cuba if you give us Florida. And the Spanish said, yeah, okay. You're thinking, what? That's not a very good deal now. It was a pretty good deal then, because what was Florida? Nothing. Swamp, alligators. They didn't know what, they saw these flying things. They didn't know what to call them, so they called them little flies. The Spanish word for fly is mosca. So they used the diminutive and called them mosquitoes. They saw these giant reptiles. They didn't know what to call them, so they called them the lizard, el lagarte, right? So they said to them, so when the British took Havana and said, we'll give it back to you, you give us, sure. So from 1763 to 1783, Florida was part of the British Empire. Who knew that? Anything interesting happened in North America between 1763 and 1783 that you might have heard about? Yeah. So when revolution broke out, the people in Florida were all British. They're like, no, we like England. We're going to stay loyal. So 1783, the British get defeated in the revolution. They're like, the heck with this. We're going to keep Canada and some of the Caribbean islands. And you guys, Spain, you can have Florida back. So number 4, Seminoles are indigenous to Florida. No, They're not. They're snowbirds like you guys. They're cousins of the Creeks who came down from Georgia and Alabama in the late 1700s, which is pretty recent when you think about it. There were probably 500,000 indigenous peoples in Florida when the Europeans arrived in the early 1500s, and within 2 centuries, they were gone. What killed them? Everybody always gets this right. Diseases, European diseases, which is not to say that the Europeans weren't also trying to do a pretty good number on them. And of course, how do we remember those indigenous peoples? By naming streets and towns after them. It's like the joke about the developer who knocks down all the oak trees and names the street Oak Street. So we have the Calusa, the Apalachee, the Timucuans, the Tequesta, the Hobes, the Tocobagas. All around the state, you go around and places are named for these groups that we rendered extinct. They're gone. There's none left. Zero. Florida has been part of America longer than it was part of Spain. No. Spain declared Florida. Anybody here from New England? No? Okay. Plymouth Rock. St. Augustine is 55 years older than Plymouth Rock. By the way, we went there with the kids, and the guy says, it's probably not the rock. And I said, my lips are sealed. So St. Augustine, 1565. But if you count to 1513 when they claimed it, until 1819 when the United States took over, that's 300 years. And 1819 to now is only 200 years. So when everybody complains about hearing Spanish on the streets of Miami, keep in mind that in Florida they spoke Spanish before they spoke English. Okay, number 6, Florida was neutral in the U.S. Civil War. Many people are really surprised to hear this. Where was Florida in the Civil War? South. South. They were proudly Southern. Slaveholding. The whole thing. They were the 3rd state to leave. 3rd. After South Carolina and Mississippi. And by the way, in the 1860 census, which only counted white people, how many white people were there south of Ocala? 600. There was nothing down here. There were about 160,000 people in Florida, and half of them were slaves. So Florida was fiercely Southern and joined the Revolution and paid the price for it. Because during the Civil War, when any of you guys Civil War buffs, it's a fascinating story. I researched it a lot. I've written many articles. I wrote a historical novel that's based in the Civil War. And I always say that everybody gets it wrong about the Civil War. The discussion should not be about what was the war about, because they'll argue about that for 500 years. The discussion should be, how do we let that happen? How did the greatest country in the world allow itself to split up and have people shooting at each other for 4 years? To me, that's the tragedy. That's probably the greatest failure in the history of our nation. I mean, these were serious differences, but we managed, over the years, we've managed to get through even the most dramatic differences. So to me, that's the tragedy of the Civil War. But when the Civil War was going on, U.S. Grant seized Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was right on the Mississippi River. And all of a sudden, the Confederacy was cut off from Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Well, those were their bread baskets. So where did they come looking? Florida, which even today is one of the largest beef-producing states east of the Mississippi River. And by the end of the war, Florida was sucked dry. They were broke. So all these people are standing in front of the State House in Tallahassee, these occupation soldiers. And the guy turns to his buddy and he goes, you know what? Here it is, February 20th, and it's beautiful. So he finishes up his gig. He goes back up to New Jersey. He goes, Mabel, we're going to take a vacation in Florida. And the next thing you know, Florida's getting some money in to help them get out of their losses. And somebody says, yeah, we'd make even more money, though, if we got people to do what? Move here. So 160,000 people in the middle of the Civil War, 22 million people now. History is not a bunch of rocks lying in a field. History is a rope. Actually, history is a row of dominoes, isn't it? So the reason there was 22 million people here, we can go all the way back to the Civil War and see how that happened. Number 7, Florida never has been bigger in area than it is now. That's not true either. When the Spanish created the colony of Florida, they actually created 2 colonies, the colony of East Florida and the colony of West Florida. If you've ever been up in the Panhandle, which I know a lot of people live down here, the Panhandle's another world, but it's actually quite beautiful. If you ever go up to the Panhandle, the river that goes through downtown Atlanta, the Chattahoochee, makes its way, forms the state line between Alabama and Georgia, comes down and cuts through the Florida Panhandle into the Gulf of Mexico. At that point, it's called the Apalachicola River. It's where the time zone changes. And everything west of that in Florida is in the central time zone. Everything west of the Apalachicola, everything east of the Apalachicola was the territory of East Florida, and St. Augustine was its capital. Everything to the west of that was the territory of West Florida, and Pensacola was its capital. And the territory of West Florida went all the way to New Orleans and included the southern halves of what's now Mississippi and Alabama. And if you go to Louisiana, you know how it's shaped like a foot. The toe of the boot still today is called the Florida parishes. So, number 8, Florida never was a Jim Crow state. When I was doing my book on the great 1928 hurricane, which I call the most underreported event in U.S. history, because it killed 3,000 people and nobody ever heard of it. When I was doing my research on this book, the editor in New York calls me and he goes, "Who made this 1928? Who made the decision to put the white victims in one mass grave and the black victims in another?" And I said, "Phil, were you sleeping in history class up there in New York?" In the 1920s, Florida was Jim Crow. And it stayed Jim Crow for a long time. In fact, the joke here is, in Florida, the further north you go, the further south you get. And the further south you go, the further north you get. You've heard that. Florida was fiercely Southern, fiercely Jim Crow. I can remember, this is my lifetime, I can remember being 6 years old in 1962, walking into a Woolworth store on Coral Way in Miami and seeing signs for white and colored bathrooms. And in my naivete, 6 years old, thinking to myself, how thoughtful of them to make sure there were enough bathrooms to go around. So yeah, Florida was anybody that, and yes, we've now become this diverse state of people from all over America, all over the world. But does anybody want to say that racism and bigotry and prejudice have been eliminated from the state of Florida? No? Well, they've been eliminated from the rest of the country. Well, there was never any of it in the North. You say, you're with me. We all have a lot of work to do. Number 9, even in the beginning of the 1900s, Miami was the biggest city in Florida. No. In 1900, Miami had 900 people. And by the way, at the beginning of World War II, Boca Raton had 800 people. But in 1900, what was the biggest city in Florida, in South Florida? Anybody? In South Florida. Anybody? Key West. Key West had 17,000 people in 1900 because it was a big fishing village and because of salvage. All those ships wrecked on the reefs and you got to keep whatever you could dig out. Number 10, modern Florida sprang in 1964 from the forehead of Walt Disney. I wish I could tell you how many times people have said, what are you talking about? Would you write all these? But Florida has no history. There's no history in Florida. Well, there's plenty of history in Florida. No, it's good. And yes, most of it happened in the 20th century. I'll grant you that. Even though we go all the way back to 1513 and long before that, right? There were people here for thousands of years. We always forget about that. But most of it did happen in the 20th century. But what a fascinating history. The Gilded Age, all the hotels coming up, the tourism explosion, the real estate explosion, the crash, the hurricanes, World War II in Florida, when U-boats sank 21 ships between Cocoa Beach and Boca Raton in 2 months. Who knew that? You could stand on the beach on Delray Beach and watch the ships burning. And by the way, during World War II, Florida military bases grew from 40 to 143. And all those guys that were down here training, they turn to their buddy and they say, it's February 20th, and it's really beautiful. And they went back north and they said, Mabel, we're moving to Florida. So in 1940, Florida had 2 million people. In 1950, Florida had 3 million people. Is that a lot? Well, that's 1.5 in just 10 years. By 1970, when I was 14, Florida had 7 million people. And they now have 22 million people. Nobody applauded. Now, this is the part where I say, do I wish you guys had all moved here? Well, I don't think you want me to lie. But please, it's not the quality. It's the quantity. We have 22 million people here. We're bigger than some countries. That's okay. There's plenty of room in Florida. We have plenty of open, no, we have plenty of open space. Our expressways are empty. There's no traffic on the expressways. Well, we never have a water crisis, do we? How about power? A power crisis because the systems are overloaded? No, Florida, we can handle 22 million people. No, we cannot. Is it your fault that you all moved here? No, because they told you to, so you did. There's this wonderful postcard that I got on eBay because I always look for Florida stuff, and it's from like the 30s, and it's a cartoon. And in the first frame, there's a guy standing there, and he's in the snow, and he's got a shovel, and there's a snowman next to him. He's freezing. In the next frame, he's on the beach in Florida, and there's a bikini babe on each side of him. You cannot underestimate the power that little postcard would have in a gift shop in the train station in Philadelphia when it's snowing like crazy right out front. So all the big newspapers up front had ads saying from Florida real estate, come move to Florida. So everybody did. But somewhere along the line, they discovered that growth in and of itself isn't necessarily good. That growth is like alcohol. It needs to be taken in what? Moderation. Did we do that? No, we did not. We had a party that would make my pals in the old frat jealous, green with jealousy. It wasn't an alcohol party, it was a growth party, but it was an orgy nevertheless. And like any good party, what do you wake up with the next morning? A hangover. What is our hangover? Our hangover is that we have 22 million people here. Our hangover is that you ever have to drive to West Palm, to Palm Beach International Airport at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to catch a flight? Yeah, that's our hangover. Our hangover is that what used to be a moderate drought in terms of rainfall now becomes a catastrophic drought. What changed? Not the supply, right? You ever wonder why the median strips are all nice and green when there's a drought? Because that's natural Florida vegetation. They hang in during a drought. But we built all these homes and seeded them with exotic vegetation that we call Bermuda grass. It doesn't grow naturally in Florida, and you have to take thousands of gallons of perfectly good drinking water and pour it on that exotic vegetation a couple of times a week, or it will die. Think about that. And by the way, every time you convert an acre of forest to an acre of and toilet bowl, what do you think happens, right? That's our hangover. Our hangover is when I go up to Chicago or Indiana to visit my wife's family, and I'm flying back, I usually fly out of Lauderdale because in Boca, you're pretty much halfway, and you sometimes get a better flight out of Lauderdale. So if you've ever flown into Lauderdale from the Midwest, you know the route they take. They pretty much come right down the Mississippi River, out into the Gulf of Mexico, turn left, and pretty much go right up 595, right up Alligator Alley. So you're flying in at night, pitch black, you're over the Everglades, and all of a sudden you see this kind of glow in the distance, which is Fort Lauderdale. You get a little closer, and then there's a fence. And then the other side of that fence is the Sawgrass Expressway. And on the other side of the Sawgrass Expressway is the hockey arena and the outlet mall and the townhouses And it keeps going right to the airport, right to the cruise ships, right to the Atlantic Ocean. And from the air, that line where that fence is that separates the Everglades from the Sawgrass Expressway could not be more profound. And does anybody for a second want to debate what would happen if that fence wasn't there? Okay? In the 1960s, they wanted to build a jet port 30 miles west of downtown Miami, literally in the middle of the Everglades. Then they thought maybe they would make it 30 miles west of Boca. Think about this. Think in your head, what's 30 miles west of here? Yeah. And what did they want to do to get people to that jet port? It was going to be the biggest jet port in the world. What would they do to get people to that jet port? An expressway. And what would be all up and down that expressway? 7-Elevens, gas stations, houses. Now, a lady you might have heard of, if you've studied any Florida history, named Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. It's a tragedy that a high school named for her became the center of the news because of that horrible massacre. But she was an environmentalist who started a group that said, you can't put this jet port out in the Everglades because you'll tear up the Everglades, you'll destroy the Everglades. And they stopped the jet port. Now, interestingly, they had already laid down the landing strips, and pilots still use them for touch and go training. And if you fly over on your way into Miami, sometimes you can see the airstrips. So that's what would have happened if people had allowed it to happen. There'd be no Everglades. We'd be wall-to-wall 7-Elevens and houses all the way across the Everglades, all the way to Naples and Fort Myers. Well, I don't think that would be a very nice place to live. It certainly wouldn't be the Florida you came here for. And so what we need to do, and I'm not running for anything, I'm not supposed to have an opinion because even though I'm retired, I still think like a reporter. It's okay to have an opinion, no one's supposed to know your opinion. But what we need to do is we need to hire, and by hire I mean elect, wise local officials and state officials, and I know that sounds like an oxymoron, who will try to make decisions that are good for the people who still want to move here. Ask your cousins and your buddies, they still want to move here, don't they? A few years ago, they said, oh, the rate has gone down. Didn't go to zero, it just went down a little. I think it's coming back pretty soon. I live over by the Boca Airport, and I hear those planes from New York, those private planes, going over my head every 10 minutes. So you have to make decisions for those people because they're allowed to move here, whether I like it or not. You have to make decisions for the people who are already here. And you have to make decisions for the people like me who grew up here, who have seen the Florida they love vanish so fast that you can see it happening with the naked eye. Well, how do we do that? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I'm not going to lie to you. When I was a reporter, we always pressed those elected officials, and the bottom line is we were kind of hypocrites because we didn't know the answer. Now, it wasn't our job to know the answer. It was their job for them to know the answer, and then we put it in the paper. But the bottom line is, I don't know what the answer is, and it would be hard enough if everybody in Florida considered themselves a Floridian and cared about what happened to Florida. So yes, I've come full circle. And so if a Jewish guy could proselytize, I should tell you to please tell your friends, learn about Florida and its history. Oh, and if I can go off on a little side tangent here. You've been hearing a lot in the news right now about the laws that politicians want to pass, where you wouldn't teach history if it would make people feel uncomfortable or guilty. People say to me, why should I feel guilty about something that happened 100 years ago? Why should I feel guilty about slavery? I wasn't here. Why should I feel guilty about what we did to the American Indians? I said, well, first of all, you should feel guilty because it's the right thing to do. Second of all, because even though it happened before you, you are benefiting from it. Every inch of land in America was stolen. Every inch, think about it. And after we stole it, we kidnapped millions of people, brought them over here, and used them as livestock. Now, is anybody want to debate me? So, yes, we should feel guilty. We should feel uncomfortable, because otherwise you have a nation of ignorant people. When I started writing my Florida history column, I got about 9 columns in, and a guy writes me and he goes, why is so many of your Florida columns about race? You talk about lynching, you talk about slavery, you talk about Jim Crow. And I said, sir, you ever heard of Willie Horton? The guy who robbed Willie Sutton, the guy who robbed banks. And they asked him, why do you rob banks? What did he say? Because that's where the money is. So you want me to write about Florida history but leave out the racism? Really? I'm not going to do that. I'm in the truth business. So you folks might be familiar with this. There's a thing called March of the Living. And this is a thing where Jewish kids go to Europe and march through the concentration camps. And this is their way of giving the finger, if I may say that. This is their way of saying, you tried and you failed. It's very profound. You know who marches with them a lot of the times? The grandchildren of the commandants. Why do they march? Because in Germany, and I have no love for Germany, but in Germany, they teach the history. And the history makes young people in Germany feel guilty and uncomfortable, even though it happened before they were born. You following me here? And those people in Germany who feel guilty and uncomfortable turn it into action and go to the camps and march with Jews through the camps. And you know who's the only people in Germany that don't feel guilty or uncomfortable? The neo-Nazis. So, do you want to live in America where people don't feel guilty and uncomfortable about the way we treated indigenous peoples and black people in this nation? Is that the nation you want to live in? That's not the nation I want to live in. And even if I'm in the truth business, I'm in the history business, because people need to feel guilty and uncomfortable about what happened in America. Somebody said to me, I moved here, my family came here in the 1920s. Why are they not responsible for what happened in slavery? I said, do you brag about the greatness of America? Well, of course I do. I said, well, then you have to own the warts as well. When your kid comes home from school with an A, great. When he comes home from school with an F, he's still your son. You don't take his picture out of your wallet. So the idea that we should not teach history because it would make people feel uncomfortable and guilty, really, I don't know about you, I'm going to keep talking about Florida history, including the part that's going to make you feel uncomfortable and guilty. Everybody okay with that? So I've covered a lot of material. I've managed to offend all of you at some point, I think. But I hope I've made you appreciate that whether you came here 10 minutes ago or were born here, whether you're 8 or 80, you need to care about Florida. I really need you to care about Florida. I'm not saying, you can still be nostalgic for your neighborhood back in Cincinnati. I'm still nostalgic for my neighborhood in Miami. That's fine. You want to keep rooting for the Yankees? Okay. But there are people who give money to city council candidates in New York. I'm serious. There are people that have subscribed to the New York Post for the 50 years they've been down here and have never bought a Palm Beach Post. You live here now. You live here now. So care about the place and make it a better place. So I've covered a lot of material. I think I have some time for questions and comments. How are we doing? Okay, questions and comments. Sir. The question was, of the 22 million living in Florida, how many are in Palm Beach County? I believe the latest population of Palm Beach County is about 1.6 million. You know that Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County make up a huge chunk of the state. I had a lady come down from in the 2008 election, Obama-McCain. They came down. They said, "Can we talk to a reporter?" So she says, she says, "Can we interview?" I said, "Sure." I'm not going to give my opinion, but she goes, "Okay." She goes, "Who do you think is going to win Florida?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to say who I think is going to win Florida. I'm not going to predict." I said, "But the question really should be which Florida? Because if you've traveled anywhere in this state, a guy in Pensacola and a guy in Miami could not be more different." I was in Jacksonville last week. it don't look anything like Boynton Beach. You know, are you talking about the Florida in Southeast Florida where you have the huge Hispanic population and all the transplants from the Northeast? Are you talking about the West Coast where you have all the Midwestern transplants? Are you talking about that I-4 corridor, which just by itself is one of the most schizophrenic places politically? Are you talking about the Panhandle with all the military? Are you talking about Pensacola, which might as well be Alabama? Are you talking about Jacksonville, which might as well be Georgia? So Florida is this huge schizophrenic place. There is no one Florida. Frankly, that's one of the things I love about Florida is that it makes it fascinating to write about. So that's I hope I answered your question. Other questions? Yes, sir. How accurate do you think the 1619 project is? The 1619 project, I have to say I have not read it yet. It's about, it follows the course of the black diaspora from the early slave ships to today. I have no reason to believe that it's not accurate. Clearly, there's no dispute that millions of Africans were kidnapped and brought here and used as livestock. That's a fact, and it's also a fact that more of them died on the way here. They never got here, and the ones that did get here, living conditions were so bad that many of them were dead within a couple of years, and they just went back and stole more. So that part to me, is not within dispute. Do I think the U.S. The comment is the premise of the 1619 project is that 1619 kind of marks the unofficial birth of America as we know it. You know, again, this comes back to what I talked about earlier. We should face now the question. The thing the nuance that we get into is that people say, I don't want to hear that Florida, that America is a nation that is solely about racism or solely about stealing land from the American Indian. I don't think that should be I don't want to hear that was our sole reason to exist. And I have a rule called Eliot's first rule of politics, which I use all the time with my kids. And the first rule of politics is that the answer is almost always somewhere in the middle. To suggest that America was strictly and exclusively created on an ideal of racism and bondage, no. But to suggest that it wasn't a big part of our history and that we didn't benefit from it is to do a disservice. The White House was built by slaves. I mean, come on. The original state capitol in Tallahassee was built by slaves. There's a existing plantation near Jacksonville where you can walk among the huts where these slaves lived. So again, I believe the answer is somewhere in between. We are not a nation founded on racism, but let's not kid ourselves. Thomas Jefferson is one of my favorite people. He was a brilliant writer and did great things, but he owned slaves. And does that disqualify him? Well, I wish it. Part of me wants to disqualify him because that's a horrible thing, but then we wouldn't have Jefferson. So it's very difficult. It's not easy. History isn't. If history was cut and dry, it would all fit in a half-hour TV show. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. That's right. Her comment is that her grandson petitioned the Marlins. I guess this is when they were planning to move out of the football stadium. he petitioned for them to put a stadium in Broward as a more central location. You know, I always liked, if you've ever been down towards the airport, you know where that Amtrak station is, right behind Broward Boulevard? It's Amtrak, Brightline, Tri-Rail, they all meet there. There's a ton of state-owned land under that bridge that they could have fit the stadium in there. I like that idea. When they started talking about putting it in Miami, I wanted it on the bayfront, sort of like the one in San Francisco, so that every time they went to a commercial and they did that aerial, all the people up north would be jealous. But you notice a trend there. But the idea of putting it on the old Orange Bowl site was that that area would build up around it. Didn't happen. I am going to root for the Marlins because they are the home team. People ask me, they say, oh yeah, you like baseball, who do you root for? I looked at them, I said, who do you mean who I root for? Imagine me walking into a bar in Manhattan and having the guy say, who do you root for? Or a restaurant in Cincinnati or Denver and saying, oh, which team do you root for? Are you kidding? Why is it okay? Again, you can root for wherever you want, but please acknowledge that there's a home team here. And if you don't want to root for them, that's fine, but acknowledge that they're the home team. And somebody said, well, I don't root for the Marlins because they have terrible ownership and they've been lousy. And I said, okay, anybody in this room from Philadelphia? Anybody in this room? Okay. Do you remember in the 50s and 60s, the Phillies were the worst team in baseball? They were the worst team on opening day. They were the worst team at the All-Star break. They were the worst team at the end of the season. They were the worst team every day for 15 years, never got out of last place. At any time, did anybody in Philadelphia think about the idea that they would stop rooting for the Phillies? The lady says, no, they're the home team. I said, aha. So that's why I root for the Marlins. They're my home team. I have been to every home opener in the history of the franchise, and I will be there on March 31st if there's a season. Other questions? Way back there. The question was, what are some highlights of growing up in Miami? And even though I've been up here for 30-something years, why not go back to Miami now that I'm retired? You know, I like it I live in Boca. The thing I like about the Boca area is that I feel like I've got a foot in each of the two, what the TV people call markets. You know, if you turn on the TV, there's Miami stations and West Palm station. And I don't miss, when I go down to see my folks, I don't miss that traffic, that's for sure. I have a sister and brother in Miami. My folks are in Miami. I have another sister up here. I'd like to think that I'm close enough that I don't have to go back and live in Miami. I go down there all the time. I went down there today. I'll be back there on Wednesday. I still have a lot of old high school buddies. We're coming up on our 48th anniversary. Highlights of growing up. You know, again, I got to go back to sports. Miami Dolphins, perfect season. I was, in 1972, I was 16 years old. My brother was 12, and my dad let us go to a dark corner of Miami Airport on a Sunday night at 10 o'clock to meet the team coming in. I said, Dad, why'd you do that? I could have been mugged. He said, well, it was history. I remember just all the things. I worked for a while in Miami before I came up here. I was a young reporter in 1980 when the town exploded in a span of 2 months with the Mario boat lift, with 125,000 people moving here in a month. None of them speaking English. And then right in the middle of it, the Miami riots. So that was pretty profound. So I hope I answered your questions. Other questions and comments? Yes, ma'am. Let me know if I'm... The question was, you did not discuss anything about Florida politics, and the answer is yes, ma'am. As I said, even though I'm a retired reporter, I still get called on sometimes to help out. And so in my mind, I'm always going to be a reporter. And so I take the mindset that no one should know my opinion. We were on a cruise in Australia. Oh, yeah. We were on a cruise in Australia in February of 2017. And all the Australians wanted to know, what do you think about this new President Trump? And I said, I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm a newspaper reporter. And they said, oh, come on, you're halfway across the world in Australia. No one will find out. Well, we live in a different world, right? With the internet and everything else. And by the way, as soon as they heard where I worked, they're like, oh, that's where the guy has his mansion. So if I was to say something that I love the guy or I hate the guy, don't you think that they would say, hey, we met a guy from the newspaper in the town where the guy has his mansion and he loves him or he hates him? How long would it take to get back here to my boss? We live in a different world now. And people say, well, you can give your opinion on the weekend. I said, you can't be a nun during the weekend, a whore on the weekend. Either you keep your opinion to yourself or you don't. So do I give my opinion to my friends? Sure. But do I give it publicly? No. I will say this about politics. Up until the 60s, a Republican could not get elected dog catcher in Florida. And we have not had a Democrat governor since Lon Childs, which I think was 1996. So that's a long time. Lon Childs was the last Democratic governor. Florida is a purple state. I think the latest registration, it leans a little more Republican. Obviously, we've had a series of Republican governors, Republican legislature, but I've watched it change many times in my lifetime, and I'm sure it'll change 2 or 3 times back and forth again. But it's such an important state because it's a battleground state and it's the 4th largest state. So in 2024, I'll bet my bottom dollar that there'll be TV crews all over Florida because they are going to know that it's going to come down to Florida. I was covering, Hillary Clinton came down and she was doing a rally in Lake Worth, and all these network people were there, and I'm walking up to them. I said, hi, I'm Eliot Kleinberg. Welcome to Florida where nothing happens. They all laughed. There was a question way back there. Yeah, the comment was that she moved here. She became a permanent resident in the 80s. It was pretty much a blue state at the time. Now it's red. We've had a lot of red governors. Now keep in mind a few things. Ron DeSantis, who is now extremely popular with a lot of people, one of the governors raised by about this much. Okay, and the last 2 presidential elections. Were won by Republicans, but not by that much. And in the southeast Florida counties, which are pretty heavily blue, the incumbent got a lot of votes among Cuban Americans because they felt very strongly. They heard the word socialism, and so there was a lot of politics in that regard. I'm not willing to bet on what Florida is going to be tomorrow. It is so dynamic because people keep moving here, and a lot of Midwesterners are traditional Republicans. A lot of Northeasterners are traditional Democrats, but that's not a cut and dry rule. So I'm not willing to bet on what Florida is going to look like in a year. It's changing that fast. People are still moving here, so it's going to keep changing. Other stuff I've left out. Anybody? Okay, one more. Let me get to this. Go ahead, ma'am. Go ahead. How did the Space Coast come about? How did the Space Coast come about? You've all heard of Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, He wrote a book called From Earth to the Moon. This is like in 1868, and he was in France. But and it was like one of the first science fiction books. And in his story, these guys are put in like in a giant cannon, and the projectile is a spaceship, and they shoot off the cannon and they get expelled all the way to the moon. So he got an F in science, got an F in aerodynamics. But where did that space projectile leave from? Florida. Why? Why did, all the way back to Jules Verne, why did he decide, he had it over by Tampa. Why did he decide it would go for Florida? Well, actually, believe it or not, the angle of going to the moon makes Florida a great place to launch. Secondly, you want a launch site where you can launch year-round, where it's never too cold, although with the Challenger disaster, unfortunately, it was too cold, and the engineers said, let's go anyhow, which is a great tragedy. The main thing they put it where they did, instead of over in Tampa, is that because of the way the Earth rotates, spaceships all take off kind of in an eastward direction. Next time a spaceship goes off, if you're up on the interstate, you can see it, or in your backyard, if you're lucky enough to see it, it's always going towards the east. And people say, no, it was kind of going that way. I said, well, if you're standing in Boca, you know where the Space Center is? Over there. It's way west. Look at a map of Florida, how it curves in. So they're all kind of heading to the east, and they wanted it in a place where if they had to abort, they would drop into the ocean instead of downtown Orlando. So that's why it became the Space Coast. Now, I've been up there, and I've done interviews with people who were in the early space program. All the gantries are rotting from salt water, and they're having to tear them down. They weren't very sturdy anyhow. They were built in a hurry because they were in the space race. And I went into one room, and it was about the size of, like from here to that wall, and it was filled with computers. These are 1962 computers, tubes and tape and all this other stuff. And the guy, and this whole giant room, and the guy says, you see this room? He goes like this. That's how much technology has changed. We sent people to the moon with the amount of computer technology. That spaceship had the amount of computer technology you could fit on a flash drive now, literally. Now, the Space Coast has been a tremendous boon for Florida. I think I covered 18 shuttle launches. One of the coolest things I ever did in my career. And when it came time to give them a new area code, what did they give them? 321. 321. Okay, I think there was another question way back there. Did we cover everything? Oh, yeah, because we talked about Delray Beach when I first got here. You guys probably don't know a lot about Delray. Everybody knows Lake Ida? Who was Ida? Ida was Major Linton's wife. 3 guys from Michigan came down named Boynton, Linton, and Swinton. One was a retired Confederate general, major. One was a businessman and U.S. congressman, and one ran a post office, I think. And they came down here and decided they were going to build a town. Well, they built a couple of towns. They built the town of Boynton Beach, and they built a town of Linton. But later, Major Linton ran into financial trouble, and they decided they didn't want the name of the town after somebody had run into financial trouble, so they changed it to Delray. Why do they call it Delray? Not Delray, California, not Delray, Mexico. Delray is a neighborhood in Detroit that was traditionally Hispanic. Delray means of the king. So all these guys are from Michigan, so they named it Delray Beach because of the town, the neighborhood in Detroit. So again, you guys have gotten your money's worth. Okay, I think I've covered enough area. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
If I may, Eliot, I followed your column in the Palm Beach Post for years, and I'm sure many of you did. And I noticed, of course, when it stopped publishing. I'm sure many of our congregants have read your column as well. We've enjoyed your witty observations about Florida history. I'm sure everybody here learned something new. I want to thank you on behalf of Temple Sinai of the Palm Beaches for coming out today and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm certain that everyone attending the program, both those who are here and on Zoom, have learned at least one new thing about the state of Florida and certainly about your perspective on it. Again, if anybody's interested, at the back of the room, there are several paperback books if you'd like to have a look at them. Eliot's written them all, and I'm sure he'd like to share a little bit of his knowledge with you, and you can take them home with you. Our next program will take place on Sunday, March the 20th. It is the last program of the 2021-2022 Sunday at Sinai series. I'm going to be meeting with Jane. I was talking to her early today about some ideas I have for next year. And we hope always to go bigger and better. So make a note on your calendars, March 20th, of course, it's a Sunday, 3 o'clock. We'll be sending everyone email flyers to let you know down the road. But the next program coming up has to do with history as well. I don't want to tell you more than that. Until then, Jane and I want to wish everyone here a happy Purim, Hag Sameach, and we will see you for the last program of the year again on March 20th. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I enjoyed it.